Hello, my name is Daniel Dimos. I'm going to be talking about one of the most longest and terrible American conflicts in history. This video is about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War lasted between 1963 and 1974. The Vietnam War took many lives on both sides, the American and the Vietnamese. The war was terrible and has left much bloodshed on the world. And let's hope it won't be forgotten.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East.
Gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. Give man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish of freedom, tolerance, and justice.
The 1950s brought a better and more greater image of the United States. At the end of two major conflicts, World War II and the Korean War, the United States economy and industry boomed. Soon everyone had a new TV, and new cars every week were rolling down the road. No, behind me is not a 1950s car, but it is my 1976 Chevrolet El Camino. It's very nice. The United States viewed the Soviet Union as a major problem and concern to the American way of life and democracy. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated President of the United States. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev became the new ruler of the Soviet Union. He started a campaign of de-Stalinization because of Stalin's war crimes. After the executions of Soviet operatives in the coup d'etat of 1948 in Czechoslovakia, and the rebuilding and reconstruction of Germany after World War II, Berlin, the capital of Germany, began reconstruction and was soon divided into two parts. These two parts would soon be divided by the Berlin Wall. The East Berlin was occupied by the Soviets, and West Berlin was occupied by NATO personnel and German citizens. Soon the Berlin Wall will become a major zone between the U.S., NATO, and the Soviet Union. The Communist North Vietnamese and the Catholic South Vietnamese would divide their country into two. The two parts were known as North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and were divided at the 17th parallel. Ngo Dinh Diem, the first president of South Vietnam, conducted the Denounced Communism campaign in 1955, during which communist and anti-government elements were arrested and imprisoned. This went on for another 2 years. During this period, over 4,000 people were imprisoned and 12,000 were killed and executed. After President John F. Kennedy's death in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson took over the presidency. Johnson didn't see Vietnam as a priority, instead focused more on his Great Society and other social programs. After the attack on the USS Madoc, Johnson changed President Kennedy's disengagement policy, and instead decided to expand the war. Between 1961 and 1964, the Army grew from 850,000 to 1 million military personnel. After the attacks on the United States Marine Corps barracks in Palaluku, the National Security Council launched a 3-stage bombing operation in North Vietnam. On March 5, 1965, Operation Flaming Dart, Operation Rolling Thunder, and Operation Arclight commenced. Over the course of 3 years, the bombing campaign would drop over 1 million tons of missiles, rockets, and bombs to force North Vietnam out of and for the liberation of South Vietnam. During these bombing operations, President Johnson sent 3,500 United States Marines in March of 1965 to support the ground war. In December of 1965, President Johnson had dispatched 200,000 United States Marines to South Vietnam. Having been lured into the heartland of Vietnam and the Quang Trung province, General Westmoreland, the commander of the United States military forces in Vietnam, launched his troops on the Tet holiday, January 31st, 1968, sparking the nation's uprising. Over 100 cities were attacked, and General Westmoreland's troops and the South Vietnamese troops were assaulted by the People's Army of Vietnam. In the attack, the major city of Hue was occupied by the People's Army of Vietnam and the North Vietnamese Army. General Westmoreland sent his troops to go and reclaim the city of Hue. The Battle of Hue lasted over a month and resulted in over 8,000 deaths to the Communists and over 500 dead and over 3,000 wounded and injured to the South Vietnamese Army and the United States military. During the Vietnam War, many local Vietnamese rebel groups and the People's Army of Vietnam collaborated and formed an army in South Vietnam known as the NLF, National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, in 1960. The Viet Cong would use derived guerrilla tactics and guerrilla warfare to drive their enemy out of Vietnam. Guerrilla warfare is a combat tactic that uses surprise and terror to stun and draw out an enemy, and to drop military personnel morale. This was very effective against the United States and the South Vietnamese military troops. This tactic was also very effective when used against civilians. The Viet Cong would bomb or attack civilian-occupied structures. This would cause mass fear and would also lead to many civilians to recruit into the Viet Cong rebel groups. This tactic would also be shown to be very useful and very effective in other wars, such as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Viet Cong would also use booby traps against the United States. Khe Sanh was a major United States Marine Corps base in the Quang Trung province of Vietnam. During the Tet Offensive in early 1968, the military base of Khe Sanh was repeatedly attacked by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. One of the battles lasted from January 21st, 1968 to April 8, 1968. One of the longest battles in the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, the Khe Sanh was also a place where journalists could get up close and personal to real combat of Vietnam. Over Khe Sanh's combat years, there were over 2,000 United States Marine casualties and over 15,000 Viet Cong casualties. After President Johnson's presidency, President Richard M. Nixon began withdrawals of United States troops and wanted to take over South Vietnamese defense. This was known as the Nixon Doctrine, which went from 1969 to 1974. In the spring of 1970, President Nixon withdrew 150,000 United States troops in Vietnam. During Nixon's presidency, President Nixon appealed to the silent majority of the Americans who support the war in Vietnam. Operation Menu was the secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos in 1969 and 1970. President Richard M. Nixon in the United States accused Cambodia and Laos of supporting the anti-government movements and the Viet Cong rebels. President Nixon launched several bombings of the sanctuaries and base areas that were occupied by the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong. Operation Menu lasted from March 18, 1969 to May 28, 1970 and resulted in over 40,000 casualties, but the bombings would continue until 1974. Over 2 million tons of ordnance was dropped on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos and Indochina over the years between 1969 and 1974. Over the years between 1973 and 1975, the United States would withdraw more and more troops out of Vietnam. This was a period during the final years of the Vietnam War. The President of Vietnam, too, would withdraw South Vietnamese troops in Vietnam and exchange prisoners with North Vietnam. When the communist ceasefire, Saigon had bolstered with the United States aid rolled back the Viet Cong. The communists, hammered by the United States, set up meetings in Hanoi in March of 1973. The Viet Cong top commander Tran Van Tra participated in many of the meetings. The United States ended all bombings in Vietnam in 1974. In late 1974 and early 1975, the South Vietnamese Army would rid the country of all Viet Cong. This was successful in ending the war in Vietnam. But with the Arab oil crisis and the poverty in the country of South Vietnam, the North Vietnam would go into its final offensive in April of 1975. Communist North Vietnam gained its goal and conquered the country. The United States launched Operation Frequent Win, in which they evacuated United States ambassadors and South Vietnamese citizens during the North Vietnamese takeover. The war ended with high cost. The Vietnamese had been fighting foreign involvement for 116 years after 1975. After 1975 by the Chinese, French, British, Japanese, and American. After the war of Vietnam. When the draft for Vietnam was launched in early stages of the Vietnam War, many young Americans were taken into combat in the country none of them even knew about. As the war progressed, many young Americans were dying in combat, and the war never seemed to go anywhere. When American reporters went and got pictures of the death and misery in Vietnam, the American people were outraged. Many Americans developed protests and rallies that would last until the end of the Vietnam conflict. The Vietnam War sparked the rage and hearts of many young Americans. Many American youths would set up protests and rallies because of the war and death in Vietnam. Some of the Americans went with rogue lives in which they would protest and try to spread peace and happiness in time of war and death. Bunch of liberals. Most American youths would use illegal narcotics during their protests, such as the drug and Class 1 narcotic cannabis or marijuana, or the drug LSD or grass, and some would say. Many Americans would also use rock and roll, a type of music that would become popular in the 60s as a way to spread their message of peace to the public. Many young Americans were arrested and or shot by law enforcement. Smiley face. I forgot my citations for the videos that came up in the project. The videos came from Call of Duty World at War made by Treyarch, and Weaponology and Top 10s by the Military Channel.